Nothing cuts deeper than watching respect turn to pity in the eyes of people who once looked up to you. For Duke Alaric, walking through his childhood village as a fallen man felt like carrying the weight of every disappointed soul who had believed in him. At 42, he had lost everything in the Civil War: his title, his lands, his honor. The villagers who once bowed their heads now whispered cruel jokes behind his back. When the local troublemakers brought him their gift, a massive warhorse so large it looked more like a joke than a steed, the whole village burst into laughter. They expected him to walk away in shame. Instead, Alaric quietly accepted the beast, his tarnished signet ring catching the afternoon light as he reached for the reins. But how does a disgraced duke turn the village's cruelest joke into something that would change their lives forever? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The ancient stone well at the heart of Millbrook Village had witnessed 3 centuries of joys and sorrows, but few falls had been as steep as Duke Alaric's. As children splashed their feet in the cool water and women drew buckets for their evening meals, their conversations invariably turned to the man who now lived in the abandoned miller's cottage at the village edge. "Can you believe he actually took that beast?" whispered Martha, the baker's wife, her voice carrying the particular satisfaction that comes from witnessing the mighty brought low. "That horse is bigger than my cottage door. What's he planning to do with it?" Elena Brightwater, the village healer, paused in her herb gathering to listen. She remembered a different Alaric, the young lord who had once helped her tend wounded soldiers, who had shared his own rations when supplies ran low. The man the villagers now mocked had once been their greatest protector. "Perhaps he sees something we don't," she said quietly. But her words were lost in the general murmur of gossip. Duke Alaric Thornfield had ruled the northern provinces for nearly 2 decades before the Civil War tore the kingdom apart. His lands had stretched from the Whispering Mountains to the Silver Coast, encompassing dozens of villages, 3 major towns, and some of the realm's most fertile farmland. He had been known for his just rule, his strategic brilliance in battle, and his genuine care for the common folk. But wars have a way of forcing impossible choices. When Prince Roderick challenged his brother King Aldwin's right to the throne, claiming their father's dying wish had been ignored, every noble in the realm faced a decision that would define their legacy. Alaric had known both princes since childhood, had trained alongside them, had shared their dreams of a prosperous kingdom. In the end, he chose honor over politics, supporting Prince Roderick because he truly believed, that the younger brother's claim was just. History, as it often does, proved him wrong. The war lasted 3 brutal years. Villages burned, crops withered unharvested, and families were torn apart by conflicting loyalties. When King Aldwin's forces finally cornered Prince Roderick at the Battle of Crimson Ford, Alaric led the final desperate charge that he hoped would turn the tide. Instead, he watched his prince die with an arrow through his throat, watched his own men scatter like leaves before the wind, watched everything he had believed in crumble into dust and blood. The aftermath had been swift and merciless. Traitors' lands were seized, their titles stripped, their names struck from the rolls of nobility. Alaric, who had commanded armies and advised princes, suddenly found himself with nothing but the clothes on his back and a horse too old for war. Even that horse had died during the long journey home, leaving him to walk the final 30 miles to the village of his birth. Now, as the sun set behind the Whispering Mountains, Alaric sat outside his humble cottage and studied the massive creature the village pranksters had gifted him. The horse truly was enormous, standing at least 18 hands high, with hooves the size of dinner plates and a chest broad enough to serve as a shield wall. Its coat was a deep chestnut brown, marked with white patches that looked almost deliberate, as if some cosmic artist had been having fun with his brush. "What am I supposed to do with you?" he asked the horse, who regarded him with surprisingly intelligent dark eyes. The beast, which the village children had already dubbed Thunder for the sound his hooves made on cobblestones, snorted and pawed the ground. Alaric had expected an ill-tempered, untrainable monster, but Thunder's behavior suggested otherwise. The horse was calm, almost contemplative, as if he too was taking stock of their unusual situation. Marcus Ironhand, the village blacksmith, approached with measured steps. His broad shoulders and scarred hands spoke of decades working the forge, but his eyes held the wariness of a man who had seen too much change. His son Thomas had been among the young men who had followed Alaric to war. Unlike many others, Thomas had come home, though he bore scars that would never fully heal. "Duke," Marcus began, then caught himself. "Alaric, that's quite a horse they gave you." "Indeed," Alaric replied, standing and brushing dust from his worn breeches, "though I suspect their intentions were less than charitable." Marcus studied Thunder with a practiced eye. "He's not built for speed, that's certain. But look at those legs, that chest. This is a horse bred for endurance and power. Probably has some of the old mountain stock in him." "Mountain stock?" "The war horses they bred up north before the wars. Bigger than normal horses, stronger too. They could carry a fully armored knight all day and still have fight left in them." Marcus ran his hand along Thunder's flank, and the horse stood patiently. "This one's got good temperament too. Whoever raised him knew what they were doing." Old Willem shuffled over, his walking stick tapping against the cobblestones. At 73, he was the village's unofficial keeper of memories, and his rheumy eyes had seen more than most cared to remember. He had been stable master at Thornfield Castle in his younger days, before age and arthritis forced him to retire to his daughter's cottage. "I remember you as a boy," Willem said, his voice like rustling leaves. "Always kind to the horses, always patient. Your father, bless his memory, used to say you had a gift for understanding them." Alaric felt a familiar ache in his chest. His father, Duke Edmund Thornfield, had died peacefully in his bed just 2 years before the Civil War began. Perhaps it was a mercy that he had not lived to see his son's disgrace. "That was a long time ago, Willem. Time doesn't change everything, lad. Some things run deeper than circumstances." As if responding to the old man's words, Thunder lowered his great head and nuzzled Alaric's shoulder, not aggressively, but with a gentleness that seemed almost deliberate. The touch was so unexpected, so strangely comforting, that Alaric found himself reaching up to stroke the horse's neck. Elena approached with a bundle of herbs and a small clay pot. "I brought some salve for your hands," she said, noting the rough calluses and healing cuts that marked his recent manual labor, "and something for Thunder's hooves. The roads have been hard on all the horses lately." Alaric accepted the gifts with genuine gratitude. "Thank you. You've been kinder than I deserve." "Kindness isn't about deserving," Elena replied. "It's about choosing to see the person someone can become, not just who they've been." As darkness settled over the village, families gathered around their hearth fires, sharing the day's gossip and tomorrow's worries. Most of the talk centered on the increasing reports of bandit activity in the region. Trade caravans were arriving late or not at all, and the few merchants brave enough to travel the roads spoke of well-organized groups of raiders who seemed to know exactly which shipments were worth taking. "It's not random anymore," Thomas told his father as they closed up the smithy. "These aren't desperate men taking what they can find. Someone's organizing them, training them." Marcus nodded grimly. The kingdom's army was stretched thin, focused on rebuilding the infrastructure destroyed during the Civil War. Remote villages like Millbrook were largely left to fend for themselves. In his cottage, Alaric lay on his simple straw mattress and listened to Thunder's steady breathing from the small stable he had hastily constructed. The sound was oddly comforting, a reminder that he was no longer entirely alone. Through his single window he could see the village well, illuminated by torchlight as the night watch made their rounds. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove or disprove his worth. But tonight, for the first time since his world had collapsed, Duke Alaric allowed himself to hope that perhaps his story was not yet finished. Dawn brought troubling news to Millbrook village. A merchant caravan bound for the autumn markets had been found scattered across the King's Road, 2 miles east of the village boundary. The merchants themselves had escaped with their lives, but their goods, wool, grain, and silver coin intended for trade, had vanished, along with their pack animals. Alaric learned of the attack when Elena arrived at his cottage with Thomas and 2 other young men from the village watch. Their faces carried the particular tension that comes with the realization that danger had crept closer than anyone expected. They knew exactly what to take, Thomas reported. His scarred hands clenched into fists, left the worthless trinkets, took everything of value. These aren't starving farmers turned desperate. They're professionals. In his small stable, Thunder raised his massive head at the sound of voices, ears pricked forward with alert intelligence. Alaric had been brushing the horse's coat, a morning ritual that had developed naturally over the past week. The simple, repetitive motion helped calm his thoughts, and Thunder seemed to enjoy the attention. Did anyone see which direction they went? Alaric asked, setting down his brush. North toward the thornwood, Elena replied. But the tracks were deliberately obscured. Whoever's leading them knows how to cover a trail. Alaric stepped outside, his weathered hands folding behind his back in a gesture that had once commanded war councils. For a moment, the fallen duke's bearing reasserted itself. Straight shoulders, measuring eyes, the unconscious authority of a man accustomed to making life-and-death decisions. How many attacks have there been in the past month? Thomas counted on his fingers. 7 that we know of, maybe more that haven't been reported. Always the same pattern. Professional execution, valuables taken, minimal violence, mostly. Though last week they took Martin the cooper's son, along with his cart. Haven't heard from the boy since. Elena placed a gentle hand on Thomas's arm. We don't know that anything's happened to young Peter. Perhaps nothing, Thomas interrupted, his voice rough with worry that went beyond neighborly concern. Peter was my friend, Elena. We trained together, played together as children. If these bandits are taking prisoners now, Alaric studied the young man's face and recognized something that made his stomach tighten with familiar dread. Thomas wasn't just worried about a friend. He was in love, probably with some village girl whose brother or sweetheart had been taken. War had taught Alaric to read the signs of personal stakes that went beyond duty. The village council needs to meet, Alaric said quietly. Today, the council? Elena raised an eyebrow. Alaric, you're not exactly... I'm not a duke anymore, he finished for her. I know that, but I've fought organized raiders before. I know how they think, how they operate. If you want to protect this village, you need someone who understands warfare. Thunder emerged from the stable, his massive frame filling the doorway. The horse had grown more comfortable around Alaric over the past days, but his behavior this morning seemed different. More alert, more focused, as if he too sensed the change in the air. The beast truly was remarkable. Standing beside him, Alaric realized that Thunder's size wasn't just unusual, it was potentially advantageous. The horse's broad chest could easily support heavy armor, and his powerful legs could carry significant weight over long distances without tiring. Those massive hooves could crush a man's skull, and his sheer presence was intimidating enough to scatter lesser mounts. From the leather pouch at his belt, Alaric withdrew a fragment of blue and silver cloth, all that remained of his old battle standard. He had kept it, not from nostalgia, but as a reminder of the cost of failed leadership. The torn fabric had once carried the Thornfield family crest, a silver eagle clutching an olive branch and a sword, representing the balance between peace and the willingness to fight for it. I found this among my things, he told Elena. Though they both knew he had carried it deliberately, it reminds me that good intentions aren't enough if you lack the strength to protect what matters. By afternoon, the village council had assembled in the main hall, a modest building that served as both meeting place and grain storage. The 5 council members ranged in age from Marcus, the youngest at 41, to elder Sarah, who had seen 74 winters. Their faces reflected the particular weariness of people forced to make decisions they felt unqualified to handle. Alaric stood before them, hat in hand, waiting to be invited to speak. The gesture was one of respect, but also strategy. He needed their permission to help, not their resentment. "We've all heard about the caravan," Elder Sarah began, her voice carrying decades of authority. "And we know the situation is getting worse. The question is what we can do about it." "We could send word to the king's garrison at Millhaven," suggested Councilman Peters, a nervous man who owned the village's largest grain warehouse. "Request protection." Marcus shook his head. "Millhaven's 3 days' ride, and they've got their own problems. Besides, what soldier is going to patrol these back roads when there's real fighting happening near the capital?" "We could organize our own patrols," offered Councilwoman Beth, though her tone suggested she didn't have much faith in the idea. "With what?" Thomas interjected from his place along the wall. "Half our young men are still recovering from the war, and the other half don't know one end of a sword from the other." The debate continued for nearly an hour, going in circles until Elder Sarah finally turned to Alaric. "You've been quiet, Duke. What do you think?" "I think you're trying to solve the wrong problem," Alaric said carefully. "You're talking about defending against random attacks, but these aren't random. Someone's coordinating these raids, choosing targets, planning routes. You need to think like they're thinking." He moved to the center of the room, his voice taking on the measured cadence he had once used in strategy meetings. "They're testing you. Each attack is designed to probe your defenses, measure your response time, evaluate your capabilities. They're not just stealing goods, they're gathering intelligence." "Intelligence for what?" Marcus asked. "For the main attack. The one that will matter." Alaric's eyes met each council member in turn. "They're going to hit Millbrook directly. Probably during the harvest festival, when your guard is down and your storehouses are full." The silence that followed his words was heavy with the weight of unwelcome truth. Elena, who had been granted permission to observe despite not being a council member, spoke from the back of the room. "What would you do? If you were in command?" Alaric was quiet for a long moment, studying the faces before him. These were good people, hard-working and honest, but they had no experience with the kind of organized violence that was coming their way. "I would accept that running isn't an option," he said finally. "Millbrook is your home, your livelihood, your legacy. If you abandon it, these raiders will simply move on to the next village, and the next. Someone has to make a stand. With what army?" Councilman Peters demanded. "With what you have. 43 able-bodied adults, good defensive terrain, and the advantage of fighting for something worth protecting." Alaric paused. "And with thunder." Several council members exchanged glances. The giant horse had become something of a village curiosity, but the idea of him as a military asset seemed far-fetched. "That horse is certainly large," Elder Sarah said diplomatically, "but I'm not sure." "Size isn't his only advantage," Alaric interrupted. "Thunder responds to training like no horse I've ever seen. He's intelligent, calm under pressure, and his presence alone would demoralize enemy horses. In the right hands, he could be decisive in a small engagement." The debate continued until sunset, but the outcome was inevitable. Millbrook had no choice but to defend itself, and Alaric was the only person present with the knowledge to organize that defense. As the council members filed out, Elena lingered behind. "Are you certain about this?" she asked. "Leading people into battle again?" Alaric looked out the hall's single window, where thunder stood grazing peacefully in the evening light. The horse's size made him visible from anywhere in the village, a constant reminder of the joke that had brought them together. "I'm not certain about anything," he admitted, "but I'm certain that doing nothing will get people killed." That night, as Alaric lay in his simple bed listening to thunder's steady breathing, he felt the familiar weight of command settling on his shoulders. Tomorrow, he would begin training villagers who had never held weapons, preparing defenses with minimal resources, and making plans based on incomplete information. It was exactly the kind of impossible situation that had once thrilled him, back when he believed that honor and courage could overcome any obstacle. Now, older and wiser and scarred by failure, he understood that some battles couldn't be won, but they still had to be fought. The old sword felt heavier than Alaric remembered, but its balance was still perfect in his hands. He had retrieved it from the bottom of his traveling pack, wrapped in oiled cloth alongside the last remnants of his former life. The blade was weathered but well-maintained, its steel still bright despite the nicks and scratches that told stories of a dozen battles. Thunder watched with curious eyes as Alaric moved through the basic forms in the small clearing behind his cottage. The morning air was crisp with the promise of autumn, and dew clung to the grass like scattered diamonds. It had been months since Alaric had held a weapon with serious intent, and his muscles protested the familiar motions. "Getting old," he muttered to the horse, who snorted in what might have been agreement or amusement. The sound of approaching footsteps made him pause mid-swing. Thomas emerged from the tree line, carrying a wooden practice sword and wearing the determined expression of a man who had made a difficult decision. "I want to learn," the young blacksmith announced. "Whatever you're willing to teach me." Alaric lowered his blade. "Thomas, you've already served. You've done your duty. My duty isn't finished." Thomas's scarred hands tightened on his practice weapon. "These bandits took Peter Alaric. We grew up together, learned our trades side by side. If there's a chance he's still alive, I need to be ready to help bring him home." The pain in the younger man's voice was unmistakable, and Alaric recognized the particular anguish of a friend left behind. He had felt it himself at Crimson Ford, watching his men fall while he lived. "Very well, but we start with basics. Forget everything you think you know about fighting. For the next hour, Alaric guided Thomas through fundamental stances and movements, correcting his grip, adjusting his footwork, teaching him to move with purpose rather than just strength. The young man was a quick learner, his blacksmith's coordination serving him well, but Alaric could see the frustration building as Thomas struggled with concepts that seemed simple but proved difficult to execute. "I'm too slow," Thomas complained after missing a basic parry for the third time. "You're thinking too much," Alaric replied. "In real combat, you won't have time to plan each movement. The blade needs to move before your mind decides to move it." They were interrupted by the arrival of Marcus, followed by Elena and 3 other villagers. Word of the training session had spread, and curiosity had overcome caution. "Is this where we learn to be soldiers?" asked Willem's daughter Mary, a sturdy woman who ran the village's small inn. Her tone suggested she was prepared to be skeptical. "You learn to survive," Alaric corrected. "Being a soldier is about following orders and maintaining formations. Surviving is about making smart decisions when everything goes wrong." He gestured toward Thunder, who had been grazing peacefully throughout the training session. "Watch him. He doesn't fight because he's angry or afraid. He fights when fighting is necessary, and he stops when it's not." That's the first lesson. Over the following weeks, a routine developed. Each morning brought new challenges as Alaric worked to transform ordinary villagers into something resembling a defensive force. The group grew slowly. Some days 3 people showed up, other days as many as 8. Ages ranged from Thomas at 26 to old Willem at 73. Though the elder mainly observed and offered occasional tactical insights from his military service decades earlier, Elena proved to be a natural leader among the women, organizing supplies and establishing communication systems between different parts of the village. Her knowledge of herbs and healing would be crucial if violence came to Millbrook. But she also surprised Alaric with her strategic thinking. "We can't just react to their attacks," she pointed out during one evening planning session. "We need to know when they're coming, how many there are, what they're planning." "Intelligence gathering," Alaric agreed. "But that requires people willing to take risks." "I know the forest paths better than anyone," offered Mary. "I could scout the northern approaches without being seen." Alaric studied her face, looking for the signs of bravado that often preceded poor decisions. Instead, he saw the calm determination of someone who understood the stakes. "It's dangerous work, Mary. If they catch you, if they attack the village, I'm in danger anyway. At least this way I can help protect my home." Thunder's training progressed alongside the humans. The massive horse proved remarkably responsive to commands, learning not just to carry Alaric, but to move with purpose and precision. His size made traditional cavalry tactics impossible. No formation could accommodate his bulk, but Alaric began to see other possibilities. He's not just a warhorse. Alaric explained to Marcus as they watched Thunder navigate a series of obstacles they had constructed. "He's a siege engine that eats grass," the blacksmith nodded, beginning to understand. Those hooves could crush a shield wall, and his presence would scatter their mounts. Most horses won't stand against something that size, especially if Thunder's trained to use his natural aggression. As if responding to his name, Thunder turned toward them and whickered softly. The sound was incongruously gentle coming from such a massive creature, but Alaric had learned that the horse's temperament was as remarkable as his size. Thunder could be fierce when circumstances demanded it, but his default nature was almost contemplative. The bond between man and horse deepened through shared effort and mutual respect. Thunder seemed to understand that their partnership was about more than just riding. They were preparing for something important together. When Alaric adjusted his armor or checked his weapons, Thunder would become more alert, as if sensing the gravity of their purpose. One evening, as autumn colors began painting the surrounding hills, Elena joined Alaric at the village well. The stone structure had become an unofficial gathering place where news was shared and plans were made. "I need to tell you something," she said, her voice carrying a weight that made Alaric look up from the map he was sketching. "What is it?" Elena glanced around to ensure they were alone, then spoke quietly. "I recognize you, Alaric. Not just from your reputation, I actually remember you. I served in your household before the war, in the castle kitchens." Alaric set down his charcoal and studied her face more carefully. There was something familiar about her features. Though he couldn't place the memory precisely, Lady Margaret's personal maid fell ill, Eleanor continued, and I was asked to help serve at a dinner for visiting dignitaries. You were kind to the servants, treated us like people instead of furniture. You even asked my name. The memory came flooding back, a young woman with gentle eyes and capable hands, efficiently managing details that allowed more important conversations to flow smoothly. She had been perhaps 18 then, quiet but observant. "Elena Brightwater," he said softly. "You helped organize the relief supplies when fever struck the eastern villages. I remember someone who worked tirelessly to save lives while nobles argued about who should pay for medicine." Alaric's voice carried genuine warmth. "You've grown into exactly the person I hoped you would become." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching Thunder graze in the distance. The horse's massive silhouette was outlined against the setting sun, creating an image that was both peaceful and somehow majestic. "Do you think we can do this?" Elena asked. "Defend the village, I mean." Alaric considered the question carefully. In the past weeks, he had watched ordinary people discover reserves of courage and capability they hadn't known they possessed. Thomas had become genuinely skilled with a blade. Mary's scouting reports were detailed and accurate. Even old Willem had proven valuable, his memory for defensive positions and supply management invaluable. "I think we can make them pay a price they're not expecting," he said finally. "Whether that's enough depends on how badly they want what we have. And what do we have that's worth dying for?" Alaric gestured toward the village around them, the warm lights in cottage windows, the sounds of families sharing evening meals, the sight of children playing safely in the streets. "Everything," he said simply. The broken chainmail lay spread across Alaric's small table like the fragments of a forgotten dream. Each link had been individually crafted, woven together with the skill that had once marked him as nobility. The armor had served him faithfully through countless battles, but the final charge at Crimson Ford had taken its toll. Several sections were torn beyond simple repair, and rust had crept into joints that had once moved like silk. Alaric worked by candlelight, using tools borrowed from Marcus's forge to restore what could be salvaged. The repetitive motion of cleaning, filing, and linking was meditative, allowing his mind to process the changes occurring throughout the village. Thunder's presence had become a constant source of fascination and gradual acceptance among the villagers. The horse's morning routine now included a circuit of the village perimeter, his massive hooves creating a distinctive rhythm that served as an informal patrol schedule. Children had begun leaving apples and carrots near his grazing area, and Thunder accepted these offerings with dignified gratitude. More significantly, the horse had begun responding to Alaric's commands with an intuition that bordered on the uncanny. A slight shift in weight would send Thunder into a charging gallop. A whispered word would make him freeze in perfect stillness. Most remarkably, the horse seemed to anticipate Alaric's intentions, often beginning movements before the commands were fully given. "He's reading your body language," Elena observed during one training session. She had taken to watching their practice, partly from curiosity and partly to understand the tactical capabilities they were developing. "It's more than that," Alaric replied, guiding Thunder through a complex series of turns and stops. "He's thinking ahead, anticipating what needs to happen next." "I've never seen a horse with this kind of intelligence." Thomas emerged from the forest, breathing hard from his morning run. The young blacksmith had taken to scouting the eastern approaches each dawn, a routine that served both as physical conditioning and early warning system. His face carried the grim satisfaction of someone who had found exactly what he was looking for. "They're out there," he reported. "3 of them, watching the village from the ridge above Miller's Creek. They withdrew when they saw me, but they were definitely observing us." Alaric set down the chainmail link he had been cleaning.
"How long were they there?"
"Hard to say. I spotted them around sunrise, but they could have been watching since before dawn." "Did they see Thunder?" Thomas nodded. "They had a clear view of the entire village center. There's no way they missed him." This was both good news and bad. Thunder's size made concealment impossible, but his presence would also force the bandits to recalculate their plans. No raider wanted to face an unknown quantity in battle, especially one that large and potentially dangerous. Elena pulled out a small leather journal where she had been tracking the pattern of attacks. "If they're scouting us directly, it means they're moving to the next phase. All the previous raids were against travelers or isolated farmsteads. This is the first time they've shown interest in a defended position, because we're the first ones to organize a defense," Alaric replied. "Word has spread about our training, our preparations. They need to know if we're a real threat or just making noise." Over the following days, the scouting activities intensified. Mary reported movement along the northern forest paths, always just at the edge of visibility. Willem's nephew spotted riders on the southern hills, gone by the time he could get close enough for a clear count. The village began to feel like it was living under a constant, invisible gaze, but the scrutiny had an unexpected effect on the villagers themselves. Instead of creating fear, it fostered a sense of unity that Alaric hadn't anticipated. People began checking on elderly neighbors more frequently. Mothers coordinated childcare so that fathers could attend training sessions. Even the merchants who had initially been skeptical of Alaric's presence began contributing to the defense preparations. "It's like the war brought out the worst in people," Marcus observed one evening as he fitted new horseshoes onto Thunder's massive hooves. "But this threat is bringing out the best." Alaric understood the difference. The Civil War had been about abstract concepts, political legitimacy, dynastic claims, competing visions of governance. This was about homes and families, about the right to live peacefully in the place where your parents and grandparents had built their lives. Thunder stood patiently during the shoeing process, occasionally snorting at Marcus's muttered complaints about the size of iron required for such enormous feat. The horse's calm demeanor had surprised everyone, including Alaric. Despite his intimidating appearance, Thunder seemed to genuinely enjoy the attention and activity of village life. "He's not really a warhorse, is he?" Elena asked, watching Thunder gently accept an apple from one of the village children. "He's whatever he needs to be," Alaric replied. "That's what makes him dangerous." The truth was more complex than that, but Alaric had learned to appreciate Thunder's adaptability. In training exercises, the horse could be fierce and aggressive, using his size and strength to dominate imaginary opponents. But in daily life, he was gentle and patient, carefully moving through the village streets to avoid stepping on chickens or knocking over market stalls. That evening brought news that changed everything. A merchant arrived from the eastern settlements, his cart hastily loaded with personal belongings rather than trade goods. His family huddled together on the wagon seat, their faces carrying the hollow look of people who had lost everything. "Bramblewood is gone," the merchant reported to the assembled village council. "Burned to the ground 3 days ago. They came at dawn, maybe 40 or 50 of them. Well organized, well armed. They took everything worth taking and killed anyone who resisted." The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of recognition. Bramblewood was only a day's ride east of Millbrook, similar in size and defensive capability. If the bandits could overwhelm it so completely, what chance did a smaller village have? "Did anyone escape?" Elena asked gently. "Some of the children, maybe. They scattered into the woods when the fighting started. But most of the adults—" The merchant's voice broke. "They weren't taking prisoners this time." Alaric felt the familiar cold weight settling in his stomach, the particular dread that came with realizing that a situation was worse than anticipated. The bandits had escalated from robbery to slaughter, which suggested either desperation or confidence that they could operate without fear of retaliation. "We need to assume they're coming here next," he told the council. "Probably within the week." "How can you be so certain?" Councilman Peters asked, though his voice suggested he already knew the answer. "Because we're the only organized resistance in the region. They can't afford to leave us intact while they continue their expansion." Elder Sarah's voice carried the weight of her 74 years. "Then we need to decide once and for all. Do we fight or do we run?" The debate that followed was brief but intense. Some argued for evacuation, for taking what they could carry and seeking safety in larger towns. Others insisted that abandoning Millbrook would only delay the inevitable. The bandits would eventually follow, and then they would face the same choice with even fewer resources. In the end, it was Thomas who settled the matter. "They still have Peter," he said quietly, "and probably others from the settlements they've attacked. If we run now, we're abandoning everyone they've taken." The vote was unanimous. Millbrook would make its stand. That night, Alaric worked on his chainmail with renewed urgency. Each repaired link represented a small victory against entropy, a refusal to let the past crumble entirely. Thunder dozed in his stable, occasionally shifting his massive weight with sounds like distant thunder. Tomorrow would bring the final preparations, positioning supplies, establishing fallback positions, making sure everyone understood their role in the coming battle. But tonight, in the quiet of his cottage, Alaric allowed himself to feel the fear that he couldn't show to others. He had led men into battle before, had made life-and-death decisions that affected hundreds of lives. But this felt different, more personal. These weren't soldiers following orders. They were neighbors trusting him with their lives and the lives of their children. The hand-drawn map spread across. Elena's kitchen table represented weeks of careful observation and planning. Alaric had sketched every hill, stream and forest path within 5 miles of Millbrook, marking sightlines, defensive positions, and potential escape routes with the precision of someone who understood that lives would depend on these details. Thunder's morning patrol had revealed fresh horse tracks along the northern ridge, multiple riders moving in formation, no longer bothering to conceal their presence. The time for subtlety had passed, replaced by the kind of open preparation that preceded decisive action. "They're positioning for a coordinated attack," Alaric explained to the assembled defenders. 23 adults had committed to fighting, ranging from Thomas and Mary to old Willem, who insisted his crossbow arm was still steady despite his age. Multiple approach routes, probably timed to hit us from 3 directions at once. Marcus studied the map with the careful attention of someone whose son's life might depend on understanding it perfectly. "What about the eastern approach?" You haven't marked any defensive positions there, because that's where we want them to come, Alaric replied. The terrain there funnels attackers into a narrow corridor between the mill pond and the stone wall. Thunder and I can hold that passage while the rest of you deal with the smaller groups coming from north and south. Elena traced the defensive positions with her finger, her healer's mind already calculating where wounded would need to be moved, how supplies could be distributed under combat conditions. This assumes they attack during daylight. What if they come at night? Then we use Thunder's hearing and instincts as early warning. He's more alert to danger than any human sentry, and his size makes him visible even in darkness. The partnership between man and horse had evolved beyond simple riding into something approaching telepathy. Thunder seemed to understand not just Alaric's commands, but his intentions, often responding to changes in posture or breathing that preceded verbal instructions. During practice sessions, they moved together with a fluidity that made individual action difficult to distinguish from collective motion. But the growing bond also brought growing responsibility. Alaric had begun to understand that Thunder wasn't just unusually large. He was genuinely exceptional in ways that went beyond physical dimensions. The horse's intelligence, his tactical awareness, his apparent ability to assess and respond to complex situations made him potentially decisive in the coming battle. I keep thinking about what you said, Thomas mentioned as they finished reviewing the defensive plan, about Thunder being whatever he needs to be. Alaric looked through the window toward the stable where Thunder stood, his massive head visible above the doorframe. What about it? Well, what if what we need isn't a warhorse at all? What if we need something else entirely? The question lingered as the defenders dispersed to their final preparations. Weapons needed sharpening, armor required adjustment, and families had to be prepared for the possibility that some of their members might not survive the coming day. Elena lingered after the others had left, helping Alaric roll up the map with careful precision. Her movements carried the efficiency of someone accustomed to managing details under pressure. But her eyes held the particular worry of someone who cared deeply about outcomes beyond her control. "Are you frightened?" she asked quietly. Alaric considered the question seriously. Fear was a constant companion in warfare, but it could be either a liability or a tool, depending on how it was managed. "Yes," he admitted, "but not of dying. I'm afraid of failing them again, of making decisions that get good people killed. You didn't fail at Crimson Ford," Elena said firmly. "You made the best choices you could with the information you had. Sometimes that's not enough to change the outcome, but it doesn't make the choices wrong." Her words carried the conviction of someone who had seen enough of life to understand the difference between failure and tragedy. Alaric felt some of the weight he had been carrying shift, not disappearing, but becoming more manageable. That evening brought an unexpected visitor. A young woman approached the village from the eastern road, leading a lame horse and carrying herself with the particular exhaustion that came from days of hard travel. Her clothes were torn and travel-stained, but her bearing suggested nobility, or at least comfortable upbringing. "Please!" she called out as Thomas and Mary intercepted her at the village boundary. "I need to speak with whoever leads this place. It's about the bandits." Elena and Alaric arrived within minutes, drawn by the commotion and the possibility that news was arriving from the outside world. The woman was perhaps 25, with intelligent eyes, and the kind of composure that suggested she was accustomed to being taken seriously. "My name is Catherine Blackwood," she announced. "My father holds lands near Oakenhart, about 2 days north of here. The bandits hit us 4 days ago. Did you escape?" Elena asked, already moving to assess the woman's physical condition. "I was away from the main house when they attacked, visiting tenants in the eastern fields. By the time I returned," Catherine's voice caught momentarily, "they were very thorough, very professional. But I learned something that you need to know." Alaric stepped closer, his attention sharpening. Intelligence from survivors was often the difference between successful defense and catastrophic defeat. "What did you learn?" Catherine met his eyes directly. "I saw their leader. I recognize him from descriptions. Captain Roderick Blackthorne, formerly of the King's 3rd Regiment. He was cashiered from the army 2 years ago for unauthorized requisitioning. The name hit Alaric like a physical blow. He remembered Blackthorne, a competent officer who had served under his command early in the Civil War before being transferred to other units. Ambitious, ruthless, with a talent for logistics and organization that had made him valuable despite his questionable ethics. "You know him," Catherine observed, reading the recognition in Alaric's face. "He served under me," Alaric admitted, "before he was transferred for reasons that should have gotten him hanged." The implications were disturbing. Blackthorne wasn't just a bandit leader. He was a trained military officer who understood strategy, logistics, and the psychology of warfare. His success in organizing the raids wasn't luck or natural talent. It was professional expertise applied to criminal enterprise. "There's more," Catherine continued. "He knows you're here. I heard him talking to his lieutenants about the fallen Duke who thinks he can play soldier. He's coming here specifically to settle accounts with you." Thunder emerged from his stable, as if sensing the tension in the conversation. The horse's massive presence was somehow reassuring, a reminder that they weren't entirely without advantages in the coming confrontation. "How many men does he have?" Alaric asked. "I counted at least 60 during the attack on our holdings." "Possibly more in reserve." Eleanor did the mathematics quickly. 60 trained fighters against 23 civilians with minimal combat experience, and 1 very large horse, Thomas added, though his tone suggested he understood the odds weren't favorable. Alaric studied Catherine's face, looking for signs of deception or exaggeration. Finding none, he accepted that the situation had become significantly more dangerous than anticipated. "Will you fight with us?" he asked her. Catherine smiled grimly and pulled a well-maintained sword from beneath her travel cloak. "Captain Blackthorne killed my father and burned my home. I wouldn't miss this for anything." As darkness settled over Millbrook, Alaric found himself standing beside Thunder in the stable, both of them looking out at the village lights. Tomorrow would bring violence and uncertainty, but tonight there was still peace. Still the possibility that courage and determination might be enough. Thunder nuzzled his shoulder gently, and Alaric reached up to stroke the horse's neck. Whatever happened in the coming battle, they would face it together, the disgraced Duke and the joke horse that had somehow become the foundation of hope for an entire community that Elena's medicine pouch had traveled with her through plague years and harvest festivals, containing remedies for everything from childhood fevers to battlefield wounds. The worn leather satchel represented decades of accumulated wisdom about healing, but as she checked its contents in the pre-dawn darkness, she wondered if any amount of preparation would be sufficient for what was coming. The leather was soft from years of handling, stained with the residue of countless herbs and tinctures. Inside, carefully wrapped bundles contained willow bark for pain, comfrey for wounds, foxglove for heart ailments, and a dozen other plants that could mean the difference between life and death when properly applied. "You should evacuate with the children," Alaric said quietly. He had found her in the healer's cottage, making final preparations while the village still slept. "The children are already safe, hidden in the old mine shaft with 3 adults to watch them." Eleanor's voice carried the firm tone of someone who had made an irrevocable decision. "My place is here, helping whoever needs healing." Through the cottage window, they could see Thunder standing motionless in the village square, his massive silhouette outlined against the star-filled sky. The horse had taken to positioning himself at the geographic center of Millbrook during the night hours, as if his presence alone could ward off danger. "Catherine was right," Alaric said, changing the subject to avoid arguing about Elena's choice. "Blackthorne is coming here for personal reasons as much as tactical ones. That makes him dangerous in ways I hadn't anticipated." Elena secured the medicine pouch to her belt and turned to face him fully. "Tell me about him. What kind of man are we dealing with?" Alaric was quiet for a long moment, sifting through memories he had tried to bury. Brilliant tactician, absolutely ruthless about achieving objectives. He understood that wars are won through logistics as much as fighting, controlling supply lines, denying resources to enemies, making sure your own forces are better fed and equipped than whoever you're facing. That sounds like a valuable officer. It would have been, if he had possessed any sense of honor or restraint. He began requisitioning supplies from friendly villages, claiming military necessity. When villagers complained, he had them flogged for interfering with military operations. Elena's expression darkened. "And you transferred him?" "I tried to have him court-martialed, but political considerations intervened. Blackthorn had connections at court, family members who could make trouble if he was executed. So he was quietly transferred to another commander's unit and became someone else's problem. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. Alaric's attempt at justice had failed, and now that failure was riding toward Millbrook with 60 armed men. As dawn approached, the defenders took their positions according to the plan they had rehearsed dozens of times. Marcus and Thomas anchored the northern barricade with 8 others. Their position centered around the reinforced grain warehouse that would provide both cover and symbolic protection of the village's food stores. Mary and Catherine led the southern group, positioned behind stone walls that had once marked property boundaries, but now served as fighting positions. Their smaller force, only 6 people, would rely on crossbows and the natural advantages of elevated terrain. The eastern approach, where the main attack was expected, belonged to Alaric and Thunder. They waited beside the mill pond, using the morning mist as concealment while maintaining clear sight lines toward the forest edge, where enemy riders would first appear. Elena had established her aid station in the village hall, centrally located with quick access to all defensive positions. Old Willem served as her assistant, his knowledge of battlefield injuries valuable despite his age. The waiting was always the worst part. Combat itself brought focus and clarity, but the hours beforehand filled with doubt and second-guessing every tactical decision. Alaric used the time to review his equipment one final time. Armor adjusted, weapons sharp, Thunder's makeshift barding secure but not restrictive. "Do you think we can hold them?" Catherine asked, her voice carrying across the morning stillness. "We can make them pay a price they weren't expecting," Alaric replied, echoing words he had spoken to Elena weeks earlier. "Whether that's enough depends on how badly Blackthorn wants revenge." Thunder shifted restlessly, his ears pricked forward toward sounds too faint for human perception. The horse's alertness had proven remarkably accurate in previous days. He seemed capable of detecting approaching riders at distances that exceeded human sensory ability. "They're coming," Alaric announced. Trusting Thunder's instincts completely, the attack began with a deception that revealed Blackthorn's tactical sophistication. A small group of riders appeared at the forest edge, moving slowly and apparently carelessly, as if they were scouts who hadn't expected to encounter resistance. The natural response would be to focus on these obvious targets while the main force approached from an unexpected direction. But Alaric had served under commanders who used similar tactics, and Thunder's behavior suggested that the horses in view represented only a fraction of the total enemy force. "It's a feint," he called to the other positions. "Hold your positions until you see the main attack." The small group of riders continued their casual approach until they were well within crossbow range, clearly intending to draw defensive fire that would reveal the true strength and positioning of Millbrook's defenders. When no arrows flew, they hesitated, apparently uncertain whether their ruse had been detected. Thunder's head came up sharply, and he whispered a low warning that Alaric had learned to interpret as imminent danger from multiple directions. "Now," Alaric whispered, and chaos erupted across all 3 approaches simultaneously. The main force emerged from the eastern forest, not the 20 or 30 riders that might have been expected, but nearly 40 mounted warriors in organized formation. They rode hard toward the mill pond crossing, clearly intending to overwhelm the single defender and break directly into the village center. But Thunder wasn't a single defender in any meaningful sense. The massive horse erupted from concealment like an avalanche given consciousness and malice. his hooves striking sparks from stone as he charged directly into the leading ranks of attackers. The effect was immediate and devastating. Enemy horses reared and scattered rather than face the towering apparition bearing down on them. Riders found themselves fighting their own mounts instead of engaging the enemy, while Thunder's bulk created a moving obstacle that disrupted formation integrity. Alaric guided the charge with precise timing, using Thunder's mass and momentum to maximum advantage. The horse struck the enemy formation like a catapult stone, hitting a brick wall, scattering riders and creating openings that could be exploited. But the northern and southern attacks were proceeding according to Blackthorn's plan. Professional soldiers with real combat experience were pressing hard against defensive positions held by civilians with minimal training. The sound of battle, steel on steel, shouted commands, screams of pain filled the morning air with the particular chaos that Alaric remembered. From a dozen previous encounters, Elena's aid station received its first casualty within minutes of the fighting's beginning. Thomas arrived with a crossbow bolt through his shoulder, blood flowing freely but not spurting in the pattern that would indicate severed arteries. "Mary needs help," he gasped as Elena began cutting away his shirt. They broke through the southern wall, Catherine's holding them but barely. Elena worked with swift efficiency, cleaning the wound and applying pressure to control bleeding. "Can you still fight?" "My sword arm's fine," Thomas replied grimly. In the eastern approach, Thunder continued to dominate the battlefield through sheer physical presence. Enemy riders found their horses increasingly difficult to control as the battle progressed. The scent and sound of the massive warhorse triggered instinctive fear responses that no amount of training could completely suppress, but Alaric could see that the diversionary attacks were succeeding. The northern and southern forces were being pressed back toward the village center, forced to abandon prepared positions in favor of fighting retreats that favored the attackers. Thunder seemed to sense the overall tactical situation, pausing in his assault on the eastern force to look toward the sounds of combat elsewhere. The horse's intelligence continued to surprise Alaric. Thunder understood that this wasn't just about dominating his immediate opponents, but about the larger battle for the village itself. "We need to help the others," Alaric said. Though he wasn't entirely certain Thunder could understand such complex tactical concepts, the horse's response suggested otherwise. Thunder disengaged from the scattered eastern force and turned toward the village center, moving with purpose toward the sound of the most intense fighting. What happened next would become the stuff of legend in Millbrook, though no two witnesses would ever describe it exactly the same way. The royal messenger arrived at the worst possible moment. His horse lathered with sweat and his royal livery torn by branches. He rode directly into the midst of the battle, apparently unaware that Millbrook was under attack, and his sudden appearance created a moment of confusion that briefly stilled the fighting on all sides. "Duke Alaric Thornfield," the messenger called out, his voice cracking with exhaustion. "By royal decree, I bear official documents requiring your immediate attention." Blackthorn's voice cut through the morning air like a blade. "Hold positions!" He commanded his forces, clearly as surprised by this development as everyone else. The attacking force obeyed, maintaining their threatening positions but ceasing active combat. Alaric guided Thunder toward the messenger, acutely aware that every eye, friend and enemy alike, was fixed on him. The royal seal on the documents was unmistakable, bearing the griffin and rose of the legitimate monarchy. His Majesty King Aldwin, in his wisdom and mercy, hereby grants full pardon to Duke Alaric Thornfield for his actions during the recent civil conflict, the messenger read aloud, his formal training overcoming his obvious confusion about the circumstances. "All lands, titles, and privileges are hereby restored, contingent upon sworn loyalty to the crown and acceptance of royal authority in all matters." The words hung in the air like a physical presence. After months of disgrace and exile, after losing everything he had once considered fundamental to his identity, Alaric was being offered the chance to reclaim his former life completely. Thunder shifted beneath him, and Alaric realized the horse had begun to show signs of distress. The massive animal's breathing was labored, and sweat darkened his coat despite the cool morning air. The stress of combat, combined with the physical demands of his unusual size, was taking a visible toll. "The pardon comes with conditions," the messenger continued, apparently determined to complete his official duty regardless of the circumstances. Duke Thornfield must present himself at court within 1 month to formally accept restoration and provide sworn testimony regarding certain military matters from the Civil War. Blackthorn spurred his horse forward, his weathered face twisted with anger and disbelief. "This changes nothing," he declared. "Royal pardon or not, we have unfinished business, Your Grace." The emphasis he placed on the restored title was loaded with mockery and genuine fury. Alaric understood that his former subordinate had built an entire criminal enterprise around the belief that the old order had been permanently destroyed. A royal pardon represented not just personal redemption, but the return of legitimate authority that would inevitably hunt down and destroy people like Blackthorn. "Stand down, Captain," Alaric said quietly. "You've lost the initiative, and you know it. Take your men and withdraw while you still can." "I don't think so," Blackthorn replied. "You see, I've learned some interesting things about this village during my reconnaissance. Things that suggest your royal pardon might not be the blessing it appears to be." Elena emerged from the village hall, her healer's bag in one hand and a crossbow in the other. Her appearance reminded everyone that the battle had been interrupted, not concluded, and that wounded. People needed attention regardless of political developments, but her presence also revealed something else, something that Blackthorn had apparently discovered and was preparing to use as a weapon. "Tell them about your correspondence." "Healer," Blackthorn called out. "Tell them about the letters you've been sending to certain parties in the eastern provinces." Elena's face went pale, but her voice remained steady. "I don't know what you're talking about." "I think you do. My men intercepted some very interesting messages last week. Messages to Prince Roderick's surviving supporters, discussing plans for continued resistance to King Aldwin's rule." The accusation hit like a thunderbolt. If Elena had been corresponding with the remnants of the rebellion, she was guilty of treason, and anyone who harbored her shared that guilt. The royal pardon that had seemed like salvation moments earlier could become a trap if Blackthorn could prove that Alaric was harboring known rebels. Thunder stumbled slightly, catching himself before falling, but clearly struggling with some internal crisis. Alaric dismounted immediately, running his hands over the horse's massive frame to assess the problem. "What's wrong with him?" Elena asked, her medical instincts overriding political concerns. "I don't know," Alaric replied, genuine worry evident in his voice. Thunder's breathing was becoming increasingly labored, and his eyes showed signs of distress that went beyond simple exhaustion. "He's been pushing himself too hard," Elena observed, moving closer despite the tense standoff. "A horse that size, his heart has to work harder than normal, especially under combat stress." The irony was devastating. Just as the royal pardon offered a path back to his former life, Thunder, who had become the foundation of everything Alaric hoped to accomplish in his new life, was failing. But Elena's accusation of treason complicated everything. If she was guilty, then accepting the royal pardon would require Alaric to turn her over to royal justice. If he protected her, he would forfeit his restored title and become a fugitive himself. "The letters," Elena said quietly, looking directly at Alaric. "They weren't about rebellion. They were about you." "What?" "After you arrived in the village, I contacted some old friends in the east, people who had served under Prince Roderick and survived the purges. I wanted to know if you were genuine or if this was some kind of elaborate trap." Blackthorn laughed harshly. "Correspondence with known traitors is still treason, regardless of the subject matter." Thunder sank to his knees, his massive body no longer able to support its own weight. The sight of the great horse struggling sent a ripple of genuine distress through both sides of the conflict. Even hardened warriors could recognize nobility in distress. Elena knelt beside Thunder, placing her hands on his neck and speaking in the gentle tones she used with all suffering creatures. "Easy, boy. We're going to help you. There's something else," she said, looking up at Alaric. "The letters contained responses to my inquiries. I know why you were really offered this pardon." The messenger, who had been watching the proceedings with growing confusion, cleared his throat. "There are additional documents," he said hesitantly. "Military dispatches that were to be delivered only if Duke Thornfield accepted the pardon." Alaric felt the familiar cold weight of political manipulation settling around him. Royal pardons were never simple acts of mercy. They were tools of statecraft, designed to serve the crown's interests rather than the recipient's welfare. "What do the dispatches say?" he asked. The messenger hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the circumstances, but bound by his official duties. "His Majesty requires Duke Thornfield to use his military expertise to suppress bandit activities in the northern provinces, with particular attention to organized groups that might pose threats to royal authority." The trap was elegant in its simplicity. "Accept the pardon and become the crown's agent in hunting down people like Blackthorn, or refuse and remain an outlaw. Either choice would require abandoning the life he had begun to build in Millbrook." Thunder's breathing became more regular as Elena's ministrations took effect, but the horse remained down, his strength clearly depleted. The sight of the great animal brought low seemed to crystallize something in Alaric's mind, a recognition that some things mattered more than political considerations. "Captain Blackthorn," Alaric said, his voice carrying new authority, "I'm making you an offer. Withdraw your forces now, and I'll give you a day's head start before I begin hunting you. And if I refuse?" Alaric looked around at the village he had come to call home, at the people who had accepted him despite his failures, at Thunder struggling to regain his feet, at Elena who had risked treason to verify his character. "Then we finish what we started," he said. "But not as Duke Alaric Thornfield." He turned to the messenger. "I decline His Majesty's generous offer." The royal messenger stared in shock. "You're refusing a full pardon? The restoration of your titles and lands?" "I'm choosing my obligations," Alaric replied. "And they're here." Blackthorn's expression shifted from mockery to genuine surprise to something approaching respect. "You're throwing away everything to protect a village of peasants and a traitorous healer." "I'm accepting responsibility for the choices I've made," Alaric corrected. "Something you might consider trying." Thunder struggled to his feet, swaying but upright, his intelligent eyes fixed on Alaric with what looked like approval. The horse's recovery seemed to symbolize something larger, the possibility that strength could be found in unexpected places. That recovery was possible even after catastrophic failure, the moment balanced on a knife's edge, with violence and withdrawal both equally possible outcomes. Everything that happened next would depend on how individual people chose to respond to the revelation that the old certainties no longer applied. Thunder's battle harness represented the collective effort of everyone in Millbrook. Marcus had forged the metal plates by hand, working through 3 sleepless nights to create armor that could fit the massive horse's unique proportions. Elena had padded the interior with layers of wool and leather, ensuring that protection wouldn't come at the cost of mobility. Even the village children had contributed, weaving decorative knots into the straps that transformed functional equipment into something approaching ceremonial regalia. The harness symbolized more than practical preparation. It represented the community's faith in both horse and rider, their willingness to invest hope and resources in an alliance that had begun as a cruel joke. Alaric adjusted the final buckles with careful precision, his movements watched by the assembled defenders and the royal messenger, who had agreed to delay his departure until the immediate crisis was resolved. Blackthorn's forces maintained their positions around the village perimeter, neither advancing nor withdrawing, waiting for their captain's final decision. "You realize what you're giving up," the messenger said quietly. The lands alone are worth more than most men see in a lifetime. The political influence, the social position, I realize what I'm keeping, Alaric replied, running his hand along Thunder's neck. The horse had recovered from his earlier collapse, but the episode had served as a reminder that even the mightiest creatures had limits. Elena approached with a small vial of clear liquid. Willow bark extract, she explained. It will help with any lingering pain from his exertion. And this, she handed him a leather cord strung with dried herbs. For luck. What about your correspondence with the rebel remnants? Alaric asked quietly. Let them come for me if they choose, Eleanor replied with quiet dignity. Some things are worth the risk. Catherine checked her sword one final time, her movements carrying the focused intensity of someone preparing for personal combat. Blackthorn killed my father, she said to no one in particular. Whatever happens next, I want him to remember that actions have consequences. The standoff had created a strange atmosphere of suspended tension. Both sides were prepared for violence, but the royal messenger's presence had introduced complications that no one had anticipated. Blackthorn couldn't simply withdraw without losing face, but launching a full attack against a village under potential royal protection carried political risks that went beyond immediate tactical concerns. Thomas emerged from the healer's station, his wounded shoulder bound, but his sword arm free. Mary's group is ready, he reported. Whatever we're going to do, we should do it soon. Some of the enemy horses are getting restless. Old Willem shuffled forward, carrying a horn that Alaric recognized from his youth, an ancient military signal device that had once belonged to his father. The brass was tarnished, but the sound would carry clearly across the battlefield. Thought you might want this back, Willem said simply. Duke Edmund used it at the Battle of Raven's Crossing, when he held the northern pass against twice his numbers. Alaric accepted the horn with genuine emotion. His father had been a different kind of leader, less tactical genius than inspirational presence. The sort of man who could convince others to attempt impossible things because he believed in them completely. He'd be proud, Willem added quietly, of what you've chosen, I mean. The observation carried particular weight, coming from someone who had known the Thornfield family for decades. Alaric had spent months questioning whether his choices during the Civil War had dishonored his father's memory, but Willem's words suggested a different interpretation. Thunder moved toward the village center, his massive hooves creating the familiar rhythm that had become part of Millbrook's daily soundtrack. The horse's presence drew attention from both defenders and attackers. He had become a symbol that transcended his practical military value. He knows, Marcus observed, watching Thunder's behavior. Somehow, he understands that this is the decisive moment. Blackthorn spurred his horse forward, positioning himself where his voice would carry to both sides. I'm offering terms, he announced. Surrender the healer for questioning regarding her treasonous correspondence, and my forces will withdraw without further violence. Counter-offer, Alaric replied, his voice carrying the authority he had once used to command armies. You withdraw immediately, and I won't spend the rest of my life hunting you and your men across 3 kingdoms. You're no longer a duke, Blackthorn pointed out. You have no authority to make threats. I have the authority that comes from being willing to act on my words, Alaric corrected. Test me if you doubt it. The exchange had the quality of ritual combat, 2 leaders establishing their positions before the larger conflict began. Everyone present understood that what happened next would be determined as much by willpower as by weapons. Elena stepped forward, her medical bag slung across her shoulder and her crossbow in her hands. I can speak for myself, she announced, and I say that anyone who wants me will have to come through the entire village to get me. The declaration sent a ripple of approval through the assembled defenders. Elena had become more than just the village healer. She was a symbol of the principle that communities protected their members. Regardless of outside pressures, this is your last chance, Blackthorn called out. I have 60 trained soldiers. You have 20 farmers and 1 oversized horse. The mathematics aren't complicated. Thunder raised his head and trumpeted. not a whinny or neigh, but a sound that carried elements of challenge and defiance. The noise was loud enough to make enemy horses shy and riders struggle for control. "Perhaps," Alaric replied, "but you're forgetting something important." "Which is?" "We're fighting for our homes. You're fighting for profit. That changes the mathematics considerably." The royal messenger had withdrawn to a safe distance, but his presence remained a complicating factor. Whatever happened next would be reported to the crown, potentially affecting how royal authority viewed both the outcome and the participants. "Signal the positions," Alaric told Willem. "Let everyone know we're committed." The horn's clear note rang across the village, carrying a message that went beyond tactical communication. It was a declaration that Millbrook would stand and fight, that some things were worth defending, regardless of the odds. Blackthorn's response was immediate. "Attack!" he commanded. "All positions." But something had changed in the dynamic between the opposing forces. The defenders moved with coordinated purpose, their earlier uncertainty replaced by the clarity that came with irrevocable commitment. Thunder surged forward with Alaric on his back. No longer just a large horse, but a force of nature given consciousness and direction. The battle that followed would be remembered differently by every participant, but certain elements would remain consistent in all the tellings. Thunder's charge scattered the initial assault like a stone thrown into still water. Elena's crossbow found targets with deadly accuracy. Catherine fought with the focused fury of personal vendetta, but the most significant element was something less tangible, the recognition that this wasn't just about tactical victory or military dominance. It was about the right of ordinary people to choose their own obligations and defend their own values. Regardless of what external authorities might demand, the royal messenger watched from his position of safety, taking notes that would eventually reach the crown. His report would need to explain how a disgraced duke had chosen exile over restoration, how a village of farmers had defied professional soldiers, and how a joke horse had become the foundation of legendary resistance. As the fighting intensified, Thunder's earlier collapse seemed forgotten. The massive horse moved with renewed energy, as if Elena's treatment had restored not just his physical strength, but his sense of purpose. Horse and rider functioned as a single entity, anticipating each other's movements with a precision that made individual action indistinguishable from collective will. The outcome remained in doubt, but the meaning had become clear. Whatever happened next, Millbrook had chosen to stand for something larger than immediate survival. The victory horn's ancient brass caught the morning light as Willem raised it to his lips, its clear note cutting through the chaos of battle like a sword through silk. The sound had once rallied Duke Edmund's forces at Raven's Crossing, and now it called his son's defenders to their moment of truth. Thunder's charge struck Blackthorn's eastern force like a landslide given consciousness and malice. The massive horse's hooves shook the ground with each stride, his battle harness gleaming as he crashed through the raiders' front line. Enemy horses reared and scattered rather than face the towering apparition, their riders fighting to control panicked mounts instead of engaging the enemy. Alaric guided the assault with surgical precision, using Thunder's bulk as both weapon and shield. The horse's intelligence showed in every movement, pivoting to present his armored flank to crossbow fire, using his momentum to scatter groups of riders, creating openings that could be exploited by the village defenders. But Blackthorn had positioned his forces with professional competence. Even as the eastern attack faltered under Thunder's assault, the northern and southern pincer movements pressed forward with disciplined coordination. The sound of steel on steel rang from multiple directions as trained soldiers engaged civilian defenders in earnest combat. At the northern barricade, Marcus and Thomas held the center of a line that was bending but not breaking. The blacksmith's hammer had been replaced by a sword, but his powerful arms swung both with equal effectiveness. Thomas fought with the controlled aggression of someone who had personal stakes in the outcome. His friend Peter was still missing, possibly held prisoner by these same raiders. "They're trying to flank us," Marcus shouted over the din of battle, pointing toward a group of riders attempting to circle around the grain warehouse. Elena appeared at his shoulder, her crossbow seeking targets among the mounted attackers. Her medical training had taught her anatomy with deadly precision. She knew exactly where to place a bolt for maximum effect. "Catherine needs help at the southern wall," she called back. The southern defense was indeed under severe pressure. Catherine and Mary led only 6 defenders against nearly 20 attackers, relying on the stone wall's protection and the elevated terrain's advantages. But professional soldiers were finding ways around both obstacles. Forcing the defenders to give ground steadily, Catherine fought with the focused fury of personal vengeance, her sword work displaying the training that came with noble upbringing. But fury alone couldn't overcome numerical disadvantage, and she could see that her line was beginning to crumble. Thunder sensed the tactical situation developing across multiple fronts. The horse disengaged from his assault on the scattered eastern force and turned toward the village center, moving with purpose toward the sound of the most desperate fighting. "The southern wall!" Alaric called, understanding Thunder's intention immediately. They arrived just as Blackthorn's men breached the stone barrier, pouring through gaps in the defense like water through a broken dam. Catherine was down, blood flowing from a head wound, while Mary tried to cover her with crossbow fire that was running low on ammunition. Thunder's arrival changed everything instantly. The massive horse plunged into the melee like a force of nature, his hooves striking sparks from stone as he drove the attackers back through sheer physical presence. Enemy horses refused to approach within striking distance, leaving their riders to fight on foot against an opponent who towered above them. But the coordinated assault was taking its toll on all fronts. Despite Thunder's dominance in individual encounters, the defenders were being stretched beyond their limits. Wounded villagers were being carried to Elena's aid station with increasing frequency, and ammunition for crossbows was running dangerously low. Blackthorn himself had remained in reserve, watching the battle develop from a position that allowed him to commit his remaining forces where they would be most effective. As Thunder dominated the southern approach, the former captain spurred his horse toward the northern barricade, leading a final assault that would either break the defense or exhaust his remaining reserves. "He's making his move," old Willem observed, his experienced eye tracking the enemy commander's positioning. The charge that followed demonstrated why Blackthorn had once been considered a valuable officer. 20 mounted soldiers struck the northern barricade in perfect formation, their timing coordinated to hit the defense at its most vulnerable moment. Marcus and Thomas found themselves facing overwhelming odds, their carefully prepared positions suddenly inadequate against professional military tactics. Elena abandoned her crossbow for her medical supplies, running toward wounded defenders who needed immediate attention. Her movement across the battlefield drew enemy attention, but also revealed something important. The village's defense was based as much on individual courage as tactical positioning. Thunder seemed to sense the crisis developing at the northern wall. Despite being engaged with multiple opponents at the southern position, the horse began moving toward the new threat, carrying Alaric through a battlefield that had become chaos incarnate. The sight of the massive horse charging across the village square created a moment of perfect clarity in the midst of confusion. Enemy and defender alike paused to watch Thunder's approach, understanding instinctively that this movement would determine the battle's outcome. Blackthorn saw it too, his weathered face set in grim determination as he realized that his carefully orchestrated assault was about to be disrupted by a factor he hadn't adequately considered. The joke horse that he had dismissed as irrelevant was about to become the decisive element in his defeat. Bring him down. Blackthorn commanded his archers. Whatever it takes. The broken sword lay in 2 pieces on the cobblestones, its blade shattered by the force of Thunder's hooves. Captain Roderick Blackthorn stared at the remains of his weapon with the expression of a man watching his entire world collapse into fragments. The personal duel had been inevitable from the moment Blackthorn dismounted and called Alaric's name across the battlefield. Professional soldiers understood that some conflicts transcended tactics and strategy, becoming matters of individual honor that could only be resolved through single combat. Thunder had carried Alaric to within sword's reach of his former subordinate, then stepped back with the intelligence to understand that this confrontation belonged to the humans alone. The massive horse maintained a protective circle around the combatants, his presence preventing interference from either side while the two men settled their accounts with steel. Blackthorn had been skilled. Alaric remembered that from their service together during the Civil War. His blade work was technically proficient, his footwork sound, his tactical sense sharp enough to exploit openings that less experienced fighters would miss. But skill alone wasn't enough when facing an opponent who had nothing left to lose except his commitment to protecting others. "You were always too idealistic," Blackthorn gasped, blood flowing from a deep cut across his sword arm. "Honor doesn't pay for food or shelter. Loyalty doesn't protect you when the cause you served collapses." Alaric circled warily, his own blade marked with nicks from their exchange. "You're right about one thing. Loyalty to a cause isn't enough. But loyalty to people, to principles that matter more than personal advantage, that's worth fighting for." Pretty words from someone who threw away a dukedom for a village of peasants. "I didn't throw it away," Alaric corrected, pressing his attack with renewed intensity. "I chose something better." Their swords met in a shower of sparks, the sound echoing across the battlefield where other combats had paused to watch the decisive encounter. Blackthorn's technique remained flawless, but desperation was beginning to show in his movements, the recognition that defeat here meant more than personal failure. Thunder's intervention came at the crucial moment. As Blackthorn attempted a risky thrust that might have found its mark, the massive horse shifted position slightly, his bulk creating a shadow that momentarily blinded the attacking captain. The distraction lasted only seconds, but it was enough for Alaric to counter. With a strike that sent Blackthorn's sword spinning from nerveless fingers, the broken blade landed with a metallic clatter that seemed to signal the end of more than just individual combat. Around the village perimeter, enemy resistance was collapsing as word spread that their captain had fallen. Professional soldiers understood when a cause was lost, and retreat became more attractive than pointless sacrifice. "Yield," Alaric commanded, his sword point at Blackthorn's throat. The fallen captain looked around at his scattered forces, at the village that had refused to be conquered, at the massive horse who had become the symbol of successful resistance. "To a farmer and his plough horse?" he asked with bitter irony. "To someone who chose his obligations instead of having them chosen for him," Alaric replied. Thunder moved closer, his intelligent eyes fixed on Blackthorn with what might have been curiosity or judgment. The horse's presence seemed to emphasize the transformation that had occurred. The joke gift had become the foundation of victory. The disgraced Duke had found redemption not in restoration but in service. Elena arrived with her medical supplies, her healer's instincts overriding political considerations. "He's wounded," she observed, noting the blood loss from Blackthorn's sword arm. "He's defeated," Alaric corrected, but he stepped back to allow Elena access to her patient. The wounded need treatment, regardless of which side they fought for. The gesture said everything about the kind of leader Alaric had become. Victory hadn't made him cruel or vindictive. If anything, it had reinforced his commitment to principles that transcended immediate circumstances. Blackthorn accepted Elena's ministrations with grudging respect. "You could have killed me," he said to Alaric. "I could have," Alaric agreed. "But dead men don't learn from their mistakes." The royal messenger approached cautiously, his parchment still clutched in one hand despite the chaos that had surrounded him. "The offer of royal pardon remains open," he said quietly. "What you've accomplished here, defeating organized brigandage, restoring order to the countryside, this is exactly what His Majesty hoped to achieve." Alaric looked around at the village that had become his home, at the people who had trusted him with their lives. at Thunder, who represented the possibility of finding strength in unexpected places. "Tell His Majesty that Duke Alaric Thornfield died at the Battle of Crimson Ford," he said finally. "But Alaric of Millbrook is honored to serve his community in whatever capacity they'll have him." The messenger made notes on his parchments, though his expression suggested he wasn't entirely certain how to explain these developments to his royal masters. And the brigands? What disposition should be made of the prisoners? Blackthorn and his surviving men, perhaps 30 of the original 60, sat under guard near the village well. Their wounds were being tended by Elena and her assistants, but their future remained uncertain. They'll face justice, Alaric decided. But justice administered by the communities they've harmed, not by royal decree or personal vengeance. It was a decision that satisfied no one completely, but reflected the reality of what had been accomplished. Millbrook had defended itself through community effort and shared sacrifice, not through appeals to external authority. The resolution of their victory should reflect those same principles. Thunder nuzzled Alaric's shoulder gently, the massive horse's touch conveying approval and affection that went beyond simple training. Their partnership had evolved during the battle into something approaching perfect understanding. Two beings who had found purpose in service to something larger than themselves. "What happens now?" Elena asked, surveying the aftermath of victory. Alaric considered the question seriously. The immediate threat had been defeated, but larger challenges remained. The kingdom was still recovering from civil war. Banditry would continue to be a problem in remote areas, and communities like Millbrook would need to develop their own capabilities for defense and governance. "Now we build something worth defending," he said simply. "And we hope that Thunder approves of our efforts." The massive horse snorted, a sound that might have been laughter or agreement. In the distance, the royal messenger prepared for his journey back to court, carrying news that would puzzle kings and inspire storytellers for generations to come. The new village charter lay spread across the same table where Alaric had once sketched defensive positions and planned desperate strategies. The parchment was clean and formal, bearing the seals of Millbrook's elected council and the signatures of every adult villager. Its contents would have surprised anyone familiar with traditional feudal arrangements. But the document reflected something unprecedented, a community that had earned the right to govern itself through blood and sacrifice. "Protector of Millbrook," Eleanor read aloud, her finger tracing the carefully inscribed words. Not lord or duke, but protector. Someone whose authority comes from service rather than birthright. Alaric accepted the charter with hands that showed the calluses of recent manual labor mixed with the sword cuts of combat. The document represented a compromise between his military expertise and the village's commitment to self-determination. But it also symbolized something larger, the possibility of leadership based on earned trust rather than inherited privilege. Thunder grazed peacefully in the village square, his massive presence no longer a curiosity, but an accepted part of Millbrook's daily rhythm. Children played around his hooves with complete confidence in his gentle nature, while their parents discussed the practical matters of reconstruction and planning for winter. The aftermath of victory had brought challenges that were less dramatic but equally important than the original battle. Prisoners needed to be processed and judged, wounded required extended care, and the village's defensive preparations needed to be maintained in case other brigand groups decided to test their resolve. Most significantly, word of Millbrook's successful resistance had spread throughout the northern provinces, bringing visitors who wanted to understand how a village of farmers had defeated professional soldiers. Some came seeking military advice, others hoping to recruit Alaric for their own causes. But all departed with stories that would grow in the telling. Catherine had chosen to remain in the village, at least temporarily, her noble upbringing proving valuable in negotiations with traveling merchants and official representatives. Her father's lands had been destroyed, but she had found purpose in helping establish the legal frameworks that would allow communities like Millbrook to function independently. The royal response has been interesting, she reported during one evening council meeting. They're not entirely sure how to categorize what happened here. A village successfully defending itself should be celebrated, but a noble refusing restoration sets uncomfortable precedents. Thomas had recovered fully from his shoulder wound and had taken charge of training new recruits in basic military skills. Young Peter had been found among Blackthorn's prisoners, traumatized but alive, and his rescue had validated the village's decision to fight rather than submit. We've had inquiries from 6 other villages about establishing similar defense arrangements, Thomas reported. They want to know if our success can be duplicated elsewhere. The question touched on something fundamental about the nature of their achievement. Thunder's unique capabilities had certainly been important, but the real foundation of victory had been community commitment and shared sacrifice. That couldn't be duplicated by acquiring a large horse. It required people willing to risk everything for principles they considered essential. Elena had been officially cleared of any treasonous activity, largely because her correspondence with rebel remnants had actually served royal interests by identifying surviving dissidents. But more importantly, the community had demonstrated that they would protect their members regardless of outside pressures. "I've been thinking about expansion," she said one evening as she and Alaric walked the village perimeter. "Not military expansion, but the ideas we've developed here. Other communities are struggling with the same problems we faced: absent authority, organized brigandage, the need to develop local solutions to regional problems." Alaric studied Thunder, who had taken to patrolling the village boundaries each evening, as if maintaining a personal commitment to security. The massive horse had become more than just a military asset. He was a symbol of the possibility that strength could emerge from unexpected sources. "What kind of expansion?" he asked. "A network of mutual aid and shared defense, communities that commit to helping each other, sharing information about threats, providing assistance during emergencies. Not a formal alliance that might threaten royal authority, but practical cooperation between neighbors." The idea had merit, but it also carried risks. Too much success in organizing independent communities might eventually attract unwanted attention from royal authorities who preferred their subjects dependent on central government rather than capable of self-sufficiency. But those were concerns for the future. For now, Millbrook had achieved something remarkable, a demonstration that ordinary people could protect extraordinary values if they were willing to commit themselves completely to the effort. As winter approached, the village prepared for the annual harvest festival with particular enthusiasm. This year's celebration would commemorate not just agricultural success, but survival and growth under impossible circumstances. Thunder would be the guest of honor, his massive presence a reminder of how the village's greatest joke had become its greatest strength. The festival planning revealed how much had changed in the months since Alaric's arrival. Decisions were made collectively. Responsibilities were shared based on capability rather than traditional hierarchy, and everyone understood that their individual well-being depended on community success. "Do you ever regret it?" Elena asked one evening as they watched Thunder interact with the village children. "Giving up your titles, your lands, your chance to reclaim your former position?" Alaric considered the question seriously. His father's estates had encompassed vast territories, commanded impressive resources, and provided influence that extended across multiple kingdoms. The life he had chosen offered none of those advantages. Just the daily satisfaction of work that mattered and relationships based on mutual respect rather than political necessity. "I regret nothing," he said finally. "This is who I was meant to become." Thunder approached them with the measured pace that had become familiar, his intelligent eyes reflecting something that might have been contentment or approval. The massive horse had found his purpose just as clearly as the humans around him, not as a warhorse in the traditional sense, but as the foundation of something unprecedented. As autumn progressed toward winter, stories of Millbrook's resistance spread far beyond the northern provinces. Minstrels sang of the disgraced Duke who chose service over restoration, the giant horse who became a legend, and the village that proved that courage and community could overcome professional military force. But for the people who lived the reality rather than the legend, the most important outcome was simpler. They had created something worth defending and proven they had the strength to protect it. Thunder grazed in their square. Alaric planned for their future, and Elena treated their ailments, while children played safely in streets that had once echoed with the sound of approaching hoofbeats. The transformation was complete. What had begun as mockery had become hope. What had seemed like failure had revealed itself as preparation, and what everyone had assumed was a joke had become the foundation of a new kind of community. In the end, they had all learned the same lesson, that strength comes not from circumstances, but from the choices people make when circumstances become impossible. Years later, when other villages faced similar challenges, they would look to Millbrook's example and ask themselves a simple question: what would thunder do? And in asking, they would find the courage to discover that extraordinary things were possible when ordinary people refused to accept defeat as inevitable. The giant horse had taught them all something essential about the nature of gifts, that the value isn't determined by the giver's intentions, but by the recipient's willingness to find possibility where others see only problems. Alaric had accepted thunder with dignity when others expected shame, and that acceptance had transformed both of their lives in ways that neither could have anticipated. In the end, the village's cruel joke had become its greatest blessing, proving that sometimes the best gifts come in the most unexpected packages.